BBOR Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia at heart and from around the globe. And hello everybody, today is Monday, another Zodiac Monday. Welcome to the show. Although some of you will be listening to this on a Tuesday, so I apologize for any delays in the schedule. In this episode, I will be discussing the book Unsolved Murders, The Zodiac Killer and Jack the Ripper by Patrick Auerbach. But first I have a small piece of true crime news to share with you, and of course many of you have seen that O.J. Simpson has passed away at the age of 76, someone who was involved in perhaps the most famous trial of the previous century. I mean, in all seriousness, the Nicole Brown Simpson, Ronald Goldman murders were the crime of the century, and that went on to become the trial of the century. And because of the recent news, I decided to pick up an older episode of Black Box Online Radio, and I was actually listening to an interview that I did with Chris Todd, who's the author of the book Ron's Revenge, about the O.J. Simpson case. And somebody asked a question in the comments section, and they said, "The host of this show seems bizarre. Is he AI?" And to answer the second question first, is the host of this program AI? Yes. And does this person seem bizarre? Being weird is not a crime. That's all I have to say in response to that. But yes, Patrick Auerbach has written the book Unsolved Murders, The Zodiac Killer and Jack the Ripper. And it's one that I've wanted to read for some time because I've talked about the Kindle preview section on a previous Zodiac Monday, but I haven't read the book in its entirety until now. And this is a book that discusses the different suspects in the Zodiac Killer mystery, and I was quite hesitant to read a book like that because I was looking for something a little bit different. I've also talked to you guys about the book Jack the Ripper and the Zodiac Killer by Zed Simpson, which again is talking a little bit about Jack the Ripper and a little bit about the Zodiac Killer. But that book is done in a different way. Zed Simpson's book is more or less just blending everything together. Like one paragraph is about Jack the Ripper, then it switches to the Zodiac Killer, and there aren't a lot of interconnections. And I was hoping that I would find that in Patrick Auerbach's book. However, this one is really just, the first half of the book is suspect profiles about the Zodiac Killer mystery, and the second half of the book is suspect profiles about the Jack the Ripper case. And because I follow both of these, and I do Zodiac Monday and Ripper Wednesday, I'm going to devote this week to Patrick Auerbach's writings. And the suspects that he discusses in the Zodiac mystery are Arthur Lee Allen, Gary Francis Post, Jack Torrance, Larry Kane, Bruce Davis, Rick Marshall, Louis Myers, Earl Van Best, and then he just has an overall discussion on the Zodiac Killer. Now, the sections that he covers in depth really focus on Arthur Lee Allen and Jack Torrance. Those are some much larger sections. They're just more paragraphs that are devoted to the suspects. So I'm not exactly sure if Patrick Auerbach thinks more highly of Arthur Lee Allen and Jack Torrance as the Zodiac Killer, or that he just had some observations about these particular suspects. And again, let's just give the most basic introduction. The Zodiac Killer was a serial killer who operated in California in 1968 and 69. Whatever happened before or after that is still part of the mystery. And there's also an introduction that is here in Patrick Auerbach's book, and I'll read the intro line for you. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, a series of brutal and mysterious murders took place in Northern California, leaving the local communities in fear and law enforcement struggling for answers. The culprit behind these crimes became to be known as the Zodiac Killer, a name given to himself by the media after a series of cryptic messages. That sentence sounds a little bit weird. I mean, a name given to himself by the media. I mean, the Zodiac Killer gave himself the name. Of course, we have the introductory letters that came in the summer of 1969 that are partnered with a third of the first Zodiac Killer cipher, and that doesn't have any type of name. That just says, I am the murderer, I'm the killer of the 3 teenagers at Lake Herman and the girl on the 4th of July. And it's not until the August 4th letter that the Zodiac actually makes the debut, and he says, in his own words, "This is the Zodiac speaking." Now, the media did try to give a name to this killer, and they used a couple different names: the Code Killer, the Cipher Slayer, and this was maybe something that bothered the killer, but I think the name that Zodiac was already chosen. I think the name was pre-chosen, but I've talked about that in some other episodes. And who was the Zodiac killer? Let's look at Patrick Auerbach's observations about the suspects. And I don't only want to focus on Arthur Lee Allen and Jack Torrance, because there are other suspects that are mentioned in this book that I think we could use a big refresher on. For example, he has one on Gary Francis Post here, and I'm just going to read some sentences and then I'll respond. Gary Francis Post, a former police officer and prison guard, emerged as a possible suspect in the Zodiac killer case in the 1990s after his ex-wife came forward with information linking him to the murders. Now, this is a very bizarre way to share the story about Gary Francis Post, and I'm openly going to confess to you, I don't even remember these things about Gary Post being a former police officer and prison guard. Gary Post was in the Air Force, and he was a radar technician. But what people think about with Gary Francis Post is he spent the majority of his career as a house painter, and he even ran a house painting business with his partner Rodney Hamlin. They were based out of Groveland, California. Now, his ex-wife came forward with information linking him to the murders. Now, Gary Post gets on the Zodiac killer radar not because of his ex-wife. There is a story involving her, but there's an individual named Chris Avery who began to believe that Gary Francis Post was the Zodiac killer, and he's the one who contacted the journalist Dale Julin saying that he knows who the Zodiac is. He has identified the killer. It's not a theory, it's the truth. And I have to really provide a lot of just, well, unfortunately, it's throwing water on Chris Avery's story. I've had the opportunity to interview the person who introduced Chris Avery to Gary Francis Post. I've had the opportunity to talk to Chris Avery's ex-wife, all off the air, and this is just them giving their sides of the story, and they're trying to present this as a way of just setting the record straight, and they're saying that this guy's unreliable, these stories are inaccurate. Gary Post didn't even do the things in Chris Avery's story. The reasons why he believes that Gary Post was the Zodiac killer are simply not true. Now, here's something else, though, in Patrick Auerbach's book. Post's background as a law enforcement officer and his proximity to the crime scenes made him a compelling suspect in the eyes of some, and several books and articles have been written about possible involvement in the case. Well, I think that that's another odd thing to say, because Gary Post was someone who did not like police officers, in the theory. And Dale Julin even talks about this in Catching Zodiac when he says that there was an incident where Gary Post was accidentally shot by a police officer, and again, the person named Glenn who introduced Chris Avery and Gary Post said that that was just a pure accident, that his best friend's brother was trying to demonstrate unholstering a firearm and it accidentally went off and Gary Post was shot. It's not like he was hit by a bullet in the line of duty or in the line of fire or anything of the sort. So, I mean, you can take that for what you will. We have a lot of conflicting stories, and I'm not going to read the entire Gary Post section for you. I just want to go back to some other points here. There are several key gaps in the evidence against Gary Post. For example, there were no eyewitness accounts linking him to the crime scenes, and his physical appearance did not match the descriptions given by witnesses. The debate over Gary Post's possible involvement in the Zodiac killer continues to this day, with some pointing to evidence against him as his background as a law enforcement officer as evidence of his guilt. Well, now, wait a second. I don't think anybody actually thinks that Gary Post's background as a law enforcement officer, which I confess I didn't even really know about that because people don't talk about him in that way, if that's even true. I mean, people don't think that that's evidence of his guilt. I mean, being a police officer doesn't make somebody the Zodiac killer. Now, you want to talk about with some pointing to evidence against him? I mean, let's look at something else, though. You want to talk about evidence against him? Let's go back to that other paragraph in the book here, where it says that there are several key gaps in the evidence against Post. For example, there were no eyewitness accounts linking him to the crime scenes. Well, how many Zodiac killer suspects have eyewitness accounts linking them to the crime scenes? We don't have many, but there are some. For example, Arthur Lee Allen was identified by Mike Mageau, albeit years later, Mike Mageau picked him out of a photo lineup. Mike Mageau was the surviving victim from the Blue Rock Springs shooting, and he pointed to a photo of Arthur Lee Allen and said, "That's the man who shot me." That would be one. Lawrence Kane has a connection to a possible Zodiac killer victim, Kathleen Johns. Same story. She identified him as the man who attempted to abduct her on March 22nd of 1970 and set her car on fire. She said that was Lawrence Kane. Now, those two are iffy because that is all done well after the fact, years after the fact, and we don't even know how credible those identifications are. Somebody picking somebody out of a photo lineup years later. But then you have somebody such as Xenophone Anthony, Zine Anthony, who is actually identified by a child witness as being the person seen leaving the taxi cab where Paul Stine was murdered on October 11th of 1969. Now, I will be clear, to give credit where credit is due. I mean, there are no eyewitness accounts connecting Gary Post to the Zodiac case. Are there any eyewitnesses that can connect a suspect to the Zodiac case? Yes. Zine Anthony was placed at the scene of a crime by the child witness who saw him leaving the Stine cab. And the problem is, though, some people think that the kid was just mistaken, or they're wondering, why doesn't everybody come to this conclusion? And I have said very clearly on Black Box Online Radio that I think Xenophone Anthony has one of the strongest resemblances to the Zodiac Killer's composite sketch out of any of the suspects that have been proposed. Of course, his hair looks different in a lot of the photos because the Zodiac is wearing the crew cut in the composite after the Stine murder, and I haven't seen an exact photo of Zine Anthony wearing the crew cut haircut. But I'm talking about the nose shape, the jawline, like the hairline as opposed to the hairstyle. All of that, I think, is extraordinarily similar. And I was corresponding once with Richard Grinnell of ZodiacCiphers.com, and he heard my comments on Black Box Online Radio, and he was actually trying to share some correction about a different type of possibility in the theory about how, what if the kid saw someone who had a strong resemblance to Xenophone Anthony, but he wasn't actually the Zodiac Killer. This is just some guy with a similar appearance. What if the kid saw that person and mistook him for Xenophone Anthony, somebody whom he knew lived in the area? Because they do look somewhat similar, and keep in mind that it would have been at night. Now, if you have any additional thoughts about Gary Francis Post as a Zodiac Killer suspect, please put your ideas in the comments section down below. And the next suspect that I want to talk about is Louis Myers. There's a suspect profile for Louis Myers that is written in Patrick Auerbach's book here. To provide some basic introductory statements about Louis Myers, he's a completely different type of suspect. Gary Post does check a lot of the boxes. He was 6 feet tall. He matches a lot of the age descriptions, and Louis Myers matches none of them. He was shorter, and he was 17 years old at the time. But at the same time, I was somewhat captivated by the story of Louis Myers, which was shared by his friend Randy Kenny. He brought Myers forward as a Zodiac Killer suspect, and I did some of my earliest Zodiac episodes about Louis Myers because I thought, is this just where everybody went wrong? Did a 17-year-old kid fool everybody? Well, let's look at the introductory statement from Patrick Auerbach on Louis Myers. In 2014, it was reported that Louis Joseph Myers had confessed to a friend in 2001 that he was the Zodiac Killer. Upon learning of a diagnosis with cirrhosis of the liver, Myers requested that his friend Randy Kenny report his confessions upon his death. Myers died in 2002, but Kenny allegedly encountered difficulties in getting officers to cooperate and take his claims seriously. There are some possible connections between Myers and the Zodiac case. He attended the same high schools as victims David Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen, and allegedly worked in the same restaurant as Darlene Ferrin. Now, this is one of the reasons why I got pulled in to the Myers story. But first, I don't think that's true. I mean, that's not true at all, right? That he attended the same high schools as David Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen. David Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen were the victims of the Lake Herman Road murders, and they didn't go to the same high school. This is one thing that everybody zones in on because they really hadn't known each other that long. They actually went to different high schools, and that David Faraday would meet her sometimes after school, and they would go out, but their first official date wasn't until December 20th of 1968, the Lake Herman Road murders. So I would challenge that Louis Myers went to high school with David Faraday, unless Patrick Auerbach is citing something that I don't see here in the book, but that's the first that I've heard. And this became the foundation of Randy Kenny's theory, and why I was so captivated by it because he's talking about how, all right, this guy Louis Myers, he went to high school with Betty Lou Jensen, that's the female victim, and then he worked in Darlene Ferrin's restaurant as a busboy. She's a server and he's a busboy, and this guy is just the type of angry, rejected individual, and they were specific targets. That the Lake Herman Road murders, killing Betty Lou Jensen, and the Blue Rock Springs shooting, killing Darlene Ferrin, that they were specific targets, that these weren't arbitrary crimes, and that he did not commit the Lake Berryessa stabbing. That's something that gets left out. I don't even know if that's mentioned here in Patrick Auerbach's book. I don't recall reading that section, but this was something that you guys in the comment section brought to my attention. Myers would not have been the perpetrator for Lake Berryessa. That would have been a copycat, and that Paul Stein, the taxi driver, was actually killed because of drug money. But there's another strong point in favor of Louis Myers being the Zodiac, and that is, during the period of 1971 to 1973, when no Zodiac letters were received, Myers was stationed overseas with the military. He was actually stationed in Germany, but that's left out here. Kenny claims that Myers confessed to targeting couples due to a bad breakup with a girlfriend. But again, that would have only been the first two crimes, because he didn't do Lake Berryessa in the theory. While officers linked to the case are doubtful, they believe the story is credible enough to warrant investigation if Kenny can provide credible evidence. And that is something that is so shocking when you just even read some of the details in Patrick Auerbach's book, when he says that, okay, Myers made the confession in 2001 but didn't pass away until 2002, yet Kenny couldn't get people to listen to his story. Well, I mean, you had like a year. I mean, where is the documentation? You had a year to actually document this. And furthermore, somebody is the Zodiac killer, yet he's only going to go through Randy Kenny. I mean, again, 1 year. 1 year. If he actually wanted to do what he was going to say, or what he was said that he wanted to do, why on earth go through this extremely ridiculous process of only telling one person and getting that person to contact the media and law enforcement? Because in Randy Kenny's story, what he's saying is that he wanted Myers wanted him to contact the media, to share his confession, and he wanted Randy Kenny to write a book and give the proceeds to the victims' families, because he wanted to come clean about being the Zodiac killer. And I mean, I think that this suspect profile here in the book leaves out a lot of info, but I also think that the entire story is just so fishy. I absolutely don't think highly of it now, and there's just so many rooms and places for doubt. And then the next suspect, though, that we're going to get to is Arthur Lee Allen. And as I said, this is a bigger suspect profile. The one on Louis Myers is like 6 paragraphs. It says Arthur Lee Allen was born in 1933 and he passed away in 1992. Robert Graysmith's book suggested that Arthur Lee Allen was investigated by the police over a 20-year period and died on 1992, may have been the Zodiac killer based on circumstantial evidence. And this is another point that we have to talk about. It's not only Robert Graysmith's book that is suggesting this. Arthur Lee Allen was the prime suspect of law enforcement, and this is something that Tom Voigt really likes to hunker down on by just saying that Graysmith didn't come up with Arthur Lee Allen as a suspect. He is just exploring the possibility of the prime suspect being the Zodiac killer. Some police detectives considered him the most likely suspect, but all evidence against Allen ultimately turned out to be negative. Despite their suspicions, investigators did not find solid evidence to prove that Allen was the killer. And I think that's a very honest statement. I mean, even to this day, some people are convinced that Arthur Lee Allen was the Zodiac, and they're convinced of that because they think that he was the prime suspect and it was just insufficient evidence. He just got away, and that he was someone who was able to slip through the cracks. Detective John Lynch of the Vallejo Police Department interviewed Arthur Lee Allen on October 6 of 1969. Allen was a suspect in the Lake Berryessa attack on September 27th of that year and claimed to have been scuba diving at Salt Point Ranch on that day. In 1971, Allen was again brought to the attention of police when his friend Donald Cheney reported that Allen had expressed a desire to kill people using the name Zodiac and attaching a flashlight to his firearm for visibility at night. All of those things were done by the Zodiac. Cheney claimed that the conversation took place no later than January 1st of 1969 in California. According to Jack Mullinax of the Vallejo Police Department, Arthur Lee Allen had a dishonorable discharge from the U.S. Navy in 1958 and was fired from his job as an elementary teacher in 1968 due to allegations of sexual misconduct with his students. Despite being well regarded by some, he was also known to be fixated on young children. Oh, I wonder if those people have regrets in thinking highly of Arthur Lee Allen. I mean, let's be very clear, Arthur Lee Allen was a scumbag. He did terrible things, but was he the Zodiac killer? That's the question. In September of 1972, the San Francisco police obtained a search warrant for Allen's home. In 1974, he was arrested and pleaded guilty to sexually assaulting a 12-year-old boy and served 2 years in prison. I actually thought it was longer than that, but that's just me. Vallejo police conducted a search at Arthur Lee Allen's home in 1991 and seized property from his residence 2 days after his death in 92. In July of 1992, victim Mike Mageau identified Arthur Lee Allen from the photo lineup as the person who attacked him. So, as we're seeing here, there really isn't a lot of in-depth analysis. It's just that the police had him on the radar, the police looked into him, and to this day, Arthur Lee Allen is the only publicly named Zodiac killer suspect. And what I think, though, is going to be more valuable is if we look at some of the challenges. Number one, Arthur Lee Allen doesn't meet all of the physical descriptions. The Zodiac had a full head of hair, and Arthur Lee Allen was balding at the time. And then Arthur Lee Allen has a much wider face than the suspect that was seen after the Stein murder. Not to mention, Arthur Lee Allen might have been too big to be the Zodiac killer. I mean, it's quite possible that the Zodiac was around the same height. Arthur Lee Allen was 6 feet tall, and the Zodiac height discrepancies are between 5 feet 8 inches and 6 feet tall. And then the last suspect profile that I want to talk to you guys about in Patrick Auerbach's book is of course going to be Jack Torrance, because as I said, that's one of the ones that he devotes more time to. And Jack Torrance is a suspect that was brought forward by his stepson Dennis Kaufman. So I'm just going to read this here. Jack Torrance was born in 1928 and he passed away in 2006. Torrance was born on February 26th of that year and passed away in '06. In 2007, his stepson Dennis Kaufman added Torrance to the list of suspects. Kaufman claimed to have evidence to support his stepfather's guilt, including a bloody knife, disturbing images on film rolls, handwritten samples, and his handwriting was similar to those in the Zodiac letters, and an executioner-style hood that Kaufman alleged was worn by the killer during the Lake Berryessa attack. The hood was discovered rolled up and hidden inside a piece of sound equipment. Although Jack Torrance passed away in 2006, his past military service in the Navy and the Air Force may tie him to the military-style boot impressions that were found at the site of the Zodiac killer's Lake Berryessa attack, and as a trained radio operator, Torrance had the skills to learn coding that may have inspired the cryptograms contained in at least 8 of the Zodiac communications. Additionally, some claim that the composite sketch, which was based on the reflections of the 3 teenagers after the murder of Paul Stein on October 11th of 1969, resembled Torrance. However, eyewitness recollections are known to be unreliable, and the Presidio Heights sketch artist has been compared, actually it doesn't say artist, I don't know why I said that. The Presidio Heights sketch has been compared to many individuals. Therefore, using such circumstantial evidence to promote a person of interest is weak. Despite purported links to Torrance, Dennis Kaufman has faced widespread criticism and has been discredited by many investigators and amateur sleuths in the Zodiac case. In 2010, the FBI performed a DNA and handwriting analysis on the items of interest submitted by Kaufman, but the results were inconclusive, neither ruling Torrance in nor out of the Zodiac mystery. And I also confess, I was not aware of that the FBI actually did DNA tests on on Dennis Kaufman's suspect, Jack Torrance, and all the results were inconclusive. But there is more in the section here, but I do want to respond to one thing. A big point of contention that people had, or a big problem that people had with Dennis Kaufman and his theory about Jack Torrance relates to something that is in one of the early paragraphs here. And that is how that he had these rolls of film which he claimed were photos of the crime scenes, and when he actually went public with them and shared them, they were just blurry images when you couldn't make anything out and you couldn't witness anything, and you couldn't actually tell what was in the photos, and people just thought, okay, this is pathetic, that's just a con man grab. I mean, the stuff about the gold-colored symbol on the Lake Berryessa hood, that's a big strike. Brian Hartnell reported that it was white. Things just about finding a knife, I mean, Dennis Kaufman openly said on national television he doesn't know what the knife was for, and then just sharing blurry photos. I'm just getting major con man vibes all across the spectrum. But to give credit where credit is due, I mean, with Jack Torrance was someone who was ex-Navy and ex-Air Force, who would have had knowledge of coding, knowledge of radio operation. This is, again, someone who's going to be thinking in a technical way, because the Zodiac Killer isn't just like some 17-year-old busboy working in Vallejo like Louis Myers. The Zodiac is drawing bomb diagrams. The Zodiac is drawing bomb diagrams. I said it more clearly that time. And he is also somebody who is going to be thinking in a way that is dealing with a lot of technical knowledge. Like, he's very clearly, the Zodiac understands the ciphers, and he understands radians, and he understands things that someone would be exposed to when they're working in the Navy. So again, this is one of the larger suspect profiles. But overall, I think you can tell by the way I'm talking about Patrick Auerbach's book that I'm not overly impressed with it. In fact, there's just a set of suspect profiles on the Zodiac and a set of suspect profiles on Jack the Ripper. And to be very honest, the Zodiac section is a little bit flimsy. And when you read this book, it becomes quite difficult, because every now and then they just says the Zodiac committed a series of brutal murders and homicides. And it's like, okay, you've already said that sentence 10 times. This is a book that is 92 pages long, 100 if you count the filler pages, and you're just saying the same sentences over and over again. If you were to take those out, it might be 75 pages. But the Jack the Ripper section is much bigger and more detailed and more thorough, and there's a lot more in the Jack the Ripper section. And Patrick Auerbach even has a Jack the Ripper conclusion, which there isn't a Zodiac Killer conclusion section. So I'm going to be looking more forward to talking about that one on Ripper Wednesday. And just the final note on Patrick Auerbach's book, Unsolved Murders, is that he doesn't cite the sources in the text. And I know this is going back on me being a former English teacher, or me just reflecting on my days back at the university, but I used to argue with people about this all the time. You don't have to put the sources in the text. I mean, you're giving the sources at the end, and that's enough. And that's what Patrick Auerbach does. At the end of his Zodiac section, at the end of the Jack the Ripper section, he gives the sources about how he got where this material, but he doesn't provide the in-text citations, and people just try to tell me over and over again, you have to cite it in the text. And I'm like, why? Otherwise, how will you know which sentence came from which source? I'm like, okay, well, that's fair enough, I guess. And otherwise, it's just going to be a blended mess, and no one will actually be able to verify anything that you're saying, because he's making a lot of strong claims about Gary Post's work history and the origin of Gary Post as a Zodiac Killer suspect. Even this thing about David Faraday and Louis Myers being classmates. Cite the sources. But I do have a lot more to talk to you guys about in the Zodiac Killer, in this Zodiac Killer episode. So I would like to first get to your supporter shout-outs, because anybody who makes a donation or contribution to help the program on Zodiac Monday will get a shout-out on Zodiac Monday. And our first one comes to us from Batman66. Batman66, thank you so much for your hard work. Also, I mean, we've been working on a lot of shorts and reels for the channel. I've been trying to put them out every day, but 7 days a week is a bit much. But, I mean, usually they're coming out about 5 days a week, and you can get those on Instagram and Facebook, as well as here on the YouTube Shorts page. Lately, they've been focused on serial killers, but I mean, I was just reading the book The Sociopath Next Door by Martha Stout, one that I've talked to you guys a lot about here on BlackBoxOnlineRadio. And she shared the story of Bloody Babs, a murderer named Barbara Graham, who was not a serial killer. She was just involved in a high-profile trial back in California. And that turned into a short episode. And that really reminded me of the old-style BBOR, where, I mean, 7 days a week I would just do an episode about whatever subject I was reading about. And I read it in The Sociopath Next Door, and I got curious, so I started reading other things about Bloody Babs online, and I mean, that's the way that this channel used to operate. and I do miss those times somewhat, but Batman66 has done a lot of the research for the shorts. Thank you so much for your regular and consistent support. And next we have River Prawn Pottery. Thanks to you as well. You two guys have really helped everything so much. And our next supporter shout out comes to us from Sam Fisher. And Sam Fisher says, "Keep up the good work, Ned." Yes, Sam Fisher has been a guest on this program in the past. He is the author of The Zodiac Killer Identity, and his suspect is Joseph Paul Franklin. I've interviewed Sam a couple times. We did one interview that was just talking about Joseph Paul Franklin as a serial killer because he was a real-life serial killer known as the Raze Killer, and also because of Sam's Zodiac theories. So please feel free to check out some of those episodes. And the next one comes to us from Susan. Susan says, "I grew up in the Bay Area in the 1960s and 70s. I still live here. I admit to being obsessed about learning everything there is to know about the Zodiac Killer, as that time is very vivid in my memory, and I recall how afraid it made me feel, as well as most people I knew. Thank you so much for covering the subject meticulously. It makes me feel as though this fascination is not abnormal, that there are people like me out there who want to know the truth. California had a lot of strange crimes and serial killers during the time I was young. I think this contributes to my fascination with true crime and the hope that justice will always prevail for the victims of disturbed evil individuals, and that we will never forget those innocent people impacted by senseless crime." Susan, thank you so much for supporting Black Box Online Radio on BuyMeACoffee.com. Oh yes, and it's totally normal to be curious about these types of cases, because as you guys have noticed on Black Box Online Radio, I've been talking more about not only the Zodiac Killer, but also Jack the Ripper, and now D.B. Cooper. Thank you to everyone who listened to the Cooper episode that came out on Friday. And I think that is something that really connects with people. It's not only just this is a true crime story, it's also the unsolved element where people just genuinely want to know the truth about who was Jack the Ripper, who was D.B. Cooper, who was the Zodiac Killer. And let's not kid ourselves, there is a problem-solving element. And evaluating the ideas based on their merits and checking out different suspects. Although I do confess that Patrick Auerbach's book isn't one that completely sold me, and in some ways it's very underwhelming. But I said I had something else to talk to you guys about, and I would like to give a shout out to Horvoje. Hope I'm saying this right. Horvoje, excuse me, Frovia, who just asked, "Can you do an episode talking about the clues in the Zodiac Killer that don't make sense?" And I think that this would be a really good time to talk about some of those things. What are the pieces of evidence that don't quite make sense? And let's go through a very important one, because I've already talked about it, and it was found in Patrick Auerbach's book about how the Zodiac Killer has been reported to have been 5 feet 8 inches tall, and the Zodiac Killer has also been reported to have been 6 feet tall. Now, how on earth do you reconcile that? And some people who are pushing taller suspects out there are just saying that Mike Mageau didn't really know what he saw at Blue Rock Springs. He was being shot, including being shot in the face. And that just leads him to ultimately say things that are inaccurate. And that's no fault of Mike. I mean, someone was trying to murder him. He wasn't trying to think about how tall the killer was. But as far as that, I think that is very important to note, because I believe that the Zodiac Killer was taller than 5 feet 8 inches tall. And even Donald Falk, who saw the Zodiac Killer, was someone who was thinking that this is a guy that is around 5'10". Now, the Robbins kids who saw the Zodiac and then provided the details for the sketch were also saying that he was 5'8", but they saw him from a distance. And when you see people from a distance, they appear shorter. I've said in the past that I thought the Zodiac was around 5 feet 10.5 inches tall. That's why at Lake Berryessa, Cecilia Shepard offered the description of 6 feet tall. So I think that is something that really needs to stand out. Now, here's another one, though, and this is even also mentioned in Patrick Auerbach's book. Did the Zodiac Killer have light reddish-brown hair, or did he have blonde hair? And that is, again, very hard to tell, because people will provide all types of explanations. They will say that their suspect was wearing a wig, like Arthur Lee Allen, because he was balding, or they will say that he was changing the color of his hair. And I've even wondered about that. Did the Zodiac Killer actually have reddish light brown hair, and he dyed his hair before the Stein murder, that would be a very, very easy disguise. If I had to guess, I would expect that the Zodiac had light brown hair. Now, that doesn't mean that these other suspects who have lighter hair or darker hair are ruled out because of the previous explanations. Here's another one, though. And, did the Zodiac killer wear glasses? Did he regularly wear glasses, or was that part of his disguise? For a long time, people believed that the Zodiac killer did not wear glasses and that he murdered Paul Stein and stole Paul Stein's glasses, but that appears to have been mostly debunked. And it seems that Paul Stein's glasses are found in evidence, and Michael Butterfield also has a photo of Paul Stein in the taxi after being shot wearing the glasses. But did he actually wear glasses? I think that he most likely did. I mean, I think that those are the Zodiac's glasses, and I just don't think he wore them all the time. You know who else thought that? Robert Graysmith. And Graysmith, of course, is trying to push Arthur Lee Allen as a suspect. He's not Graysmith's original find, but he did push that, and he talked about how Lee Allen would wear glasses for driving, and it's just, this is something that people really get hunkered down on when they say that they're suspect. Someone with a crew-cut haircut, and he would wear glasses, therefore he's the Zodiac killer. Right. You've seen countless suspect profiles like that. I do think the Zodiac wore glasses. I just don't think he did it all the time, because the Zodiac would go on to write in one of the letters that he only looked that way when he was committing the crimes. And I think that it was part of the disguise. It's just not the biggest part. I do believe that after the Stein murder, he would have gone to great lengths to change his appearance. And, I mean, it's quite possible that the Zodiac even changed his clothes or something in the alleyway, in like the little alcoves in Presidio Heights. And by change his clothes, I mean remove his shirt, or maybe turn his jacket inside and out. I don't know, something like that, and take off the glasses, and then he would have a completely different witness description. And believe it or not, those things can fool people. Now, there's actually a page, though, in Patrick Auerbach's book that I'll keep going with. So some other things here, that the Zodiac usually wore wool trousers. This is on page 22, mind you. I mean, no, people don't just usually wear wool trousers. There's no way you can connect a suspect to the Zodiac case saying that they wore wool trousers. I'm sure the Zodiac wore shorts at least once in his life. Wore a dark navy, blue, or black windbreaker. Yes, I do think the Zodiac wore that at Lake Berryessa, but he wore distinctive military boots known as wing walkers. Here's something else, though. Did the Zodiac actually own those wing walkers? Or did he actually own them in the military? Did he get them from the military? It's possible they could have been purchased at a surplus store. And another point, though, is that the Zodiac killer had a medium or slightly stocky build, yet some people are proposing very tall and skinny suspects. How on earth does that happen? And the explanation has been provided that wearing the windbreaker over top of clothing, plus the Lake Berryessa hood that was worn when the Zodiac attacked Brian and Cecilia, that altered his description to make him look fat. Do I believe that for a second? No. I think that that is just inaccurate thinking. I think that the Zodiac was a medium or stocky build type individual. And here's one survivor describes the Zodiac killer as having an odd gait, said that he walked with a heavy or lumbering gait. Now, it says a survivor here in Patrick Auerbach's book. That's from Officer Falk, right? He's the one who made the comment about the lumbering gait, or definitely noticed it. So, he would not exactly have been a survivor. And Officer Falk, again, is someone who's also been proven to be somewhat unreliable. I don't necessarily think the Zodiac would have had a leg injury like a limp. I think that maybe he was just very focused when he was walking away from the Stein cab, and that's what made it look like he had a very heavy gait. I mean, some people would even say that about me, but no one would say that I would walk with a limp. Now, here's one, though, that I do not think we should dispute too much. That is that the boot prints found at the Hartnell Shepherd crime scene were 10.5. Yes, and this is one that people really want to zone in on. The Zodiac killer most likely wore a size 10.5 shoe or boot. And Mike Morford of ZodiacKiller.site.com, now ZodiacKiller.net, pointed out that you can have a different size shoe and a different size boot. I mean, some people don't always wear the same size for everything, and that just muddies the waters a little bit, but it's true. I think that one is much harder to dispute. You'd have to be thinking about a suspect like Ted Kaczynski, who actually cut off the soles of different shoes and then glued them onto different pairs of boots and so on to disguise people. Kaczynski did indeed do that. They found it in his cabin in Montana, and he is the suspect of some, but not many. And the last one I'll talk about now is the survivor Brian Hartnell describes the Zodiac's voice as slow and measured and having a unique sound and cadence with a monotone. Now, I think the explanation for that is that the Zodiac was faking it. I think he was disguising his voice during all of the things. It's something that he would automatically do. I think that he was in full character and full persona, and that the voice that you're hearing when he was talking to Nancy Slover and talking to Brian and Cecilia was not necessarily his actual voice. That's why it's in a monotone, and he's using a unique sound. So I could be completely wrong about that, but you feel free to dispute any of these points with me if you want. But really, I would like to know more or less what you think about the Zodiac's physical description. What do you think about any of these suspects that have been mentioned here? And ultimately, I mean, I think that I'm going to have to do a bigger episode on Rovia's question, talking about just making a giant list of all the clues that don't quite make sense. I think that the biggest one is the 5 feet 8 inches tall versus 6 feet tall, but feel free to dispute that with me. And please look out for the next part of the book discussion on Ripper Wednesday, where I'm going to be talking about Unsolved Murders, the Zodiac Killer, and Jack the Ripper, and focus on the Jack the Ripper section. And that will be all for me now. Anybody can write the show at BlackBoxOnlineRadio at AOL.com. You can also get me on Facebook. My personal Facebook is in the description box. And there's always BlackBoxNid88 over on Instagram. And I will see you over there. Good.